She is raising her grandson after her daughter's death. When she ran out of money, she bought a container of Coffins for only $99. But when she opened it, what was inside changed everything. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The autumn light in Ohio carried a grayness that clung to everything like dust. It lay across the wooden fence behind the small house on the corner of Walnut Street, over the cracked porch where weeds grew through the planks, and over the tired face of Evelyn Grace as she stood by the kitchen window counting coins on the table. The old clock above the sink ticked with a slow, unhurried cruelty. Each second sounded like another reminder that time was running out. Evelyn was 70 years old, a retired school librarian with a pension barely enough to keep the lights on. She had been practical all her life, disciplined with money, organized in thought, respectful of order, but life had refused to return that respect. 6 years earlier, her husband had passed quietly in his sleep. 3 years after that, her only daughter, Emily, had lost a year-long battle with cancer that devoured not only her health, but everything Evelyn owned. When the funeral bills came, she had sold the car, pawned her wedding ring, and stopped paying for cable television. The only thing she hadn't given up was her home, and even that now trembled under the weight of overdue mortgage notices. Across the room, 6-year-old Noah, her grandson, sat at the table drawing with stubby crayons. He hummed to himself, unaware that the woman making him oatmeal each morning was terrified of losing the roof over his head. He looked so much like Emily at that age. His sandy hair, the small crease near his eye when he smiled, that sometimes Evelyn had to look away to keep from crying. The letter from the bank lay on the counter, opened, but unread since the day before. It told her she had 14 days to make a minimum payment, or the property would move toward foreclosure. 14 days. That number echoed in her head with the same rhythm as the ticking clock. That afternoon, she folded the letter into her pocketbook and walked to the grocery store to cash her pension check. The cashier smiled politely, but avoided eye contact as the old woman counted change for a bag of potatoes and a loaf of bread. Evelyn pretended not to notice. Pride was a luxury she had learned to live without. That night, after Noah fell asleep on the couch, she sat by the small lamp in the living room with a pen and notebook, trying to write down possible solutions. "Find part-time work," she wrote, but her hands trembled too much for clerical tasks, and no one wanted to hire a 70-year-old woman for anything else. Sell the house, she thought, but scratched it out almost immediately. The house was all she had left of Emily. Borrow money, she added, but there was no one left to ask. When she reached for the newspaper that served as a placemat, she saw a small advertisement printed near the bottom of the classifieds. Abandoned storage auction. Public bidding open to all. Starting price $50. It was such a ridiculous thought that she laughed. She had seen those reality shows once, people shouting, waving their hands, pretending they'd found treasure in other people's junk. Still, she folded the paper and kept it. The next morning, Noah asked for pancakes, and Evelyn made them without syrup because the bottle was empty. As he ate, she looked at the folded newspaper on the counter. It felt foolish to even consider it, yet there was a part of her that had grown tired of waiting for miracles that never came. Maybe she could find something. An antique, a box of old jewelry, anything to sell for a little money. She borrowed her neighbor Mrs. Bennett's old blue pickup truck. It smelled faintly of gasoline and lavender air freshener. Noah insisted on coming along, promising to help carry things. The drive took 40 minutes through industrial streets, lined with warehouses and half-collapsed factories. They passed rusted fences and fading billboards until they reached a lot filled with long rows of metal containers. A portable speaker crackled as the auctioneer barked numbers through a megaphone. The air smelled of oil, dust, and hot pavement. A crowd of maybe 15 people, mostly men in work boots and faded baseball caps, milled around waiting for the next container to open. Evelyn stood near the back, holding Noah's hand tightly. She felt every pair of eyes glance at her and move on. An elderly woman at a storage auction was an odd sight. The first few containers sold quickly. One held a couch and a broken television, another a stack of rusted tools, another a pile of water-damaged furniture. Each sale ended with a flash of cash, the slam of a door, and a murmur of gossip about the next one. When the auctioneer reached container number 12, something in the crowd changed. The tone shifted from excitement to uneasy laughter. "Now this one's been here a while," the auctioneer said, fumbling with the padlock. "Owner died about 10 years back. Nobody's claimed it since." He rolled up the door with a groan of metal. A wave of stale air rolled out. The crowd leaned forward, then froze. Inside, lit only by the gray daylight from the open door, stood 3 wooden coffins side by side. For a moment, there was silence. Then someone whistled low. "Jesus," a man muttered. Another laughed nervously. "You'll need holy water for that one." The auctioneer hesitated. "Well, folks, it's all legal property. Empty, far as anyone knows, starting at $50. He waited. No one moved. 50? 40? 30? The silence deepened. Evelyn looked past the faces in front of her toward the coffins. They weren't crude or sinister, just old-fashioned, hand-built, the kind she'd seen long ago when she worked part-time at a hospital helping with hospice patients. The wood was smooth, the handles polished, though dulled by time. Something about the way they were arranged, careful, deliberate, made her think of respect rather than horror. 20? The auctioneer tried again. Still no response. Evelyn felt Noah tug her sleeve. "Grandma, what's in there?" "Maybe nothing," she said quietly. "Maybe something worth remembering." Her hand lifted before she even realized she was bidding. $99, she called out. Heads turned. The auctioneer blinked, then grinned in relief. 99. Going once, going twice. Sold to the brave lady in the back. He slammed the gavel against his clipboard. A ripple of laughter went through the crowd, half amused, half pitying. Someone muttered, "Crazy old bat." Evelyn didn't care. She signed the receipt, accepted the key, and walked back to the truck with Noah trotting beside her, his small hand swinging in hers. As they drove home, the child looked up from the passenger seat. "Grandma, are we going to open them?" "Not tonight," she said, forcing a smile. "We'll see what they kept safe first." By the time they reached the house, the evening sky had turned the color of ash. The neighborhood dogs barked as she backed the pickup into the yard. Mrs. Bennett watched from her porch, eyebrows raised when she saw what was in the truck bed. "Lord have mercy, Evelyn," she called out. "You didn't bring home bodies, did you?" "Just boxes," Evelyn said, too tired to explain. With effort, she and the neighbor's son, George, unloaded the coffins into her garage. They were heavy but well-balanced. When the last one touched the ground, Evelyn leaned against the wall to catch her breath. The smell of old wood and varnish filled the air. George gave a short laugh. "Well, that's one way to keep burglars away." She smiled faintly. Maybe they'll think twice before stealing from a woman with 3 coffins. After he left, she stood alone for a long while, looking at them. There was something solemn about the scene. The 3 dark shapes resting under the flickering garage light. She wasn't frightened. Death had visited her house too many times to scare her now. Inside, Noah had fallen asleep on the couch clutching his toy car. Evelyn tucked a blanket over him and returned to the garage with a flashlight. She ran her hand along the smooth wood, felt the coolness of the metal handles, and finally lifted the lid of the first coffin. The hinges groaned softly. Inside were no bones or relics of death, just neatly arranged stacks of books, tied with faded ribbon. Beneath them, folders of papers wrapped in brown twine, all perfectly dry despite the years. She lifted one and read the top page. Riggs and Sons Funeral Home. Inventory, 1946. A wave of curiosity replaced her exhaustion. She opened another folder. Inside were ledgers filled with handwritten names, dates, and locations. Some were labeled veteran, others, no family. Each line represented someone forgotten. The second coffin contained only a small metal box. Its surface was cold, the latch rusted but intact. She carried it into the kitchen and set it on the table under the yellow light. The box opened with a sharp click. Inside lay sealed envelopes, old photographs, and a folded American flag neatly packed beneath glassine paper. Evelyn's breath caught. She recognized the careful symmetry of military archives. A small tag read, "Property of Charles Riggs, Director." When she returned to the garage, the third coffin remained locked. Searching through the papers, she found a small brass key tucked into one of the envelopes. It fit the lock perfectly. The lid creaked open to reveal 3 aluminum containers wrapped in heavy cloth, their surfaces stamped with serial numbers and government seals. She didn't touch them that night. Instead, she sat on a folding chair, the flashlight beam dancing across the shapes. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. Somewhere in that silence, she felt Emily's voice like a whisper. "Don't be afraid of what's dark, Mom. Be afraid of giving up." Evelyn stayed there until dawn, watching the first light seep through the cracks of the garage door, painting the coffins gold. When Noah woke, he found his grandmother sitting at the kitchen table with the metal box beside her and papers spread across the surface. Her eyes were red from sleeplessness, but her expression was calm, focused. "Did you find something?" he asked, rubbing his eyes. "I'm not sure yet," she said, "but I think someone wanted to be remembered, and maybe it's time we helped them." Outside, the sun climbed above the roofs, and the faint reflection of light caught on the brass handles of the coffins in the garage. Evelyn rose, poured herself a cup of coffee, and looked out the window. For the first time in months, she felt not fear, but purpose. A fragile, tentative hope that maybe this strange purchase for $99 was more than a desperate gamble. It was, perhaps, the beginning of something that could save them both. The morning breeze stirred the curtains, and she whispered to the empty kitchen, "All right, Charles Riggs. Let's see what you were trying to protect." She had no way of knowing yet that what waited in those aluminum containers would not only change her life, but bring back the forgotten names of others who had given theirs long ago. And as she stepped into the dim garage once more, notebook in hand, the faint ticking of the clock inside her house seemed less like a countdown and more like a signal that something finally had begun. The morning after the auction dawned pale and heavy, the sky the color of tin. Evelyn stood in her driveway, a steaming mug of coffee warming her hands as she watched the wind stir the dead leaves that had gathered around the pickup truck. The garage door was closed, but she could almost feel what waited behind it. The 3 coffins had not left her mind all night. She had barely slept, and when she did, her dreams were filled with flashes of unfamiliar handwriting, the smell of old wood, and the distant hum of voices she could not place. Noah came outside in his pajamas, rubbing his eyes. "Can we look inside again today?" he asked, his voice still thick with sleep. "After breakfast," she said, smiling faintly. "It's not something we rush." She didn't tell him that she was frightened, not of ghosts or anything so foolish, but of what she might find. She had felt a pulse of meaning in those old papers, something larger than her own survival. It was as though the container had been waiting for her specifically, waiting for someone who wouldn't simply see junk and walk away. When she finally lifted the garage door, the cold air met her face. The 3 coffins stood in silence, like sentinels guarding a story half forgotten. The morning light fell across their surfaces, showing the fine grain of the wood, the delicate hand-carved corners, the care of someone who had not meant them to be frightening, but dignified. She started with the first one again. The books were neatly tied, the papers precisely arranged. She placed them on a folding table she had cleared the night before and began to examine them one by one. Many of the documents bore the letterhead Riggs & Sons Funeral Home, and each was written in a looping, deliberate hand. The dates spanned decades: 1938, 1942, 1947. There were notes about funerals conducted for soldiers, many marked as no known relatives. By mid-morning, she had assembled small piles, receipts, letters, ledgers, and faded photographs. Some showed men in uniforms smiling proudly before trains and ships. Others depicted funerals, with American flags folded on caskets. Every detail spoke of a time when grief had been handled with ritual precision, when even death was recorded and filed like any other civic duty. At the bottom of the stack, she found an envelope addressed in cursive, so elegant it looked like engraving. It was sealed with red wax that had cracked with age. She hesitated, then carefully pried it open with a butter knife. Inside was a letter written on yellowing stationery. "My dearest Margaret," it began, "if you are reading this, then our home has closed, and what I could not give to the living I have hidden among the dead. These funds belong to the families of the fallen. I could not see them lost to bureaucrats and bankers. If we are gone, perhaps another heart will find them and do what must be done." The signature read, "Charles Riggs, 1952. Evelyn read it twice, her fingers trembling. This was not merely a business record. It was a confession, a secret passed through time. Someone had tried to protect something, money, perhaps, or objects of value. But more than that, a promise. She turned to the second coffin. Inside, under the small metal box she had seen the night before, she found several military tags tied together with string, each bearing a name and a serial number. She recognized some of the surnames from the ledgers she had already read. Beneath them were envelopes marked "Compensation Unpaid." The more she read, the clearer the pattern became. These were death benefits that had never reached their rightful recipients, funds that had somehow fallen through the cracks of wartime bureaucracy. Her breath quickened. Could such money still exist in the system? Could it be claimed? The thought made her uneasy, as though she were trespassing through history. Then she came to the third coffin, the one that had remained locked until last night. The aluminum containers inside still glimmered faintly in the dim light. Each was stamped with an official seal: United States Treasury, Property of Veteran Affairs, 1944. She ran her fingers over the embossed numbers. The lids were screwed shut, but the screws had rusted enough to yield when she turned them with a wrench. The first lid lifted with a reluctant sigh. Inside lay 3 long, narrow pouches wrapped in canvas. When she unrolled the first, a dull, golden gleam flashed across the surface. It was a gold bar, small but heavy, its edges worn smooth by time. She lifted it carefully, and for a moment, the weight in her hand seemed to silence everything around her. There was no question it was real. The stamp was clear. U.S. Mint, 1943. She replaced it quickly, her heart pounding. Beneath the pouches were sealed packets of war bonds and savings certificates. Some were still crisp, others fragile as old leaves. Together, they represented a fortune. $2 million. Maybe more if the certificates could be redeemed. Evelyn sank into a chair, the enormity of it pressing down on her. For months, she had lived in fear of losing everything. And now, within a single night, she held enough to buy 10 houses. But the money was not hers. That much was certain. These things had belonged to others, to families who had never known what became of the compensation meant for them. The thought filled her with a kind of grief she couldn't name. That evening, as Noah played on the porch, she sat at the kitchen table surrounded by papers and photographs, trying to piece together the connections. Many of the names had addresses beside them, most now defunct. Small towns, rural roots, P.O. boxes long abandoned. She traced one on an old map, finding that it lay only 50 miles away. What if some of these families still existed? What if the descendants were alive, unaware that their fathers or uncles had left behind a debt unpaid by the country they served? The logical part of her mind argued to take everything to the police, to report the discovery and let officials handle it. But another voice quieter, older, told her that if she did that, the government would absorb the treasure into its vaults, file the documents away, and the human story behind them would disappear again. She went to bed late, though sleep did not come easily. Her mind replayed Charles Riggs's words. Perhaps another heart will find them and do what must be done. It felt less like coincidence now, and more like obligation. The next morning brought rain, soft and steady, drumming against the roof. She made tea and called her old friend George, the mechanic from down the street. He had once served in Vietnam and still kept a veteran's badge pinned to his cap. When he arrived and she showed him what she'd found, he went silent for a long time. "Gold," he whispered finally, weighing one of the bars in his hand. "Where the hell did you find this?" "In the Coffins," she said. His eyes widened, but not with disbelief. "You need to be careful, Evelyn. Stuff like this, it doesn't just lie around without someone wanting it back." "They've been here since before I was born," she said quietly. "The man who hid them is long gone. But he wanted someone to find them for the right reason." George scratched his chin. "Then you'll need proof. You can't just walk into a bank with this. You'll need a lawyer, maybe someone who knows veteran affairs." That evening she wrote down everything she could. Names, serial numbers, the exact markings on the gold. She photographed the documents with her old phone, though her hands shook so much she had to rest between shots. The idea of possession frightened her. The gold wasn't wealth, it was responsibility. The physical weight of promises made and broken. The days that followed blurred into a quiet rhythm of research. Evelyn spent hours at the public library, searching online archives, squinting at digital scans of military records. Some of the men listed in Riggs's ledgers were marked as deceased with no known heirs. Others had distant relatives, still traceable through public records. For each name she confirmed, she made a note in her notebook, writing as though she were preserving a history that might otherwise vanish. One afternoon, Noah climbed onto her lap as she typed. "Why are you looking at all those names?" he asked. "They were people who helped make the world safe," she said softly, "and no one ever thanked them properly. Maybe we can change that." "But what about the gold?" She smiled sadly. "Gold doesn't matter if it stays hidden." Her words hung in the air, surprising even her. She realized she meant them. On the 5th day, she returned to the garage. The coffins now looked less like relics of death and more like safes, quiet containers of history. The rain had stopped, leaving the air smelling of wet earth. She brushed a layer of dust from the lid of the third one and whispered, "I'll do what you asked, Mr. Riggs. I'll finish it." That night, as she prepared dinner, she noticed a car idling across the street, a dark sedan with tinted windows. For a moment, unease pricked at her spine. Perhaps it was coincidence, or perhaps someone had followed her from the library. She closed the blinds and told herself not to imagine threats that weren't there. Still, she locked the doors and checked on Noah twice before sleeping. She awoke before dawn, mind made up. She would not hide what she'd found, but she would not surrender it blindly either. She brewed coffee, packed the letters and photographs into a folder, and wrote a note to herself in clear, determined handwriting. Tomorrow, call the Veteran Legal Office. Outside, the first light broke through the thinning clouds, spreading across the quiet street. The coffins in the garage gleamed faintly through the crack under the door, their surfaces catching the morning sun like burnished bronze. Evelyn watched the light travel slowly across the floorboards, and for the first time in years, she felt not like a woman counting the days until loss, but like a guardian entrusted with something sacred. The line between past and present had blurred, and in that fragile space, she sensed that the choice she would make next, the decision of what to do with the secret buried inside those coffins, would not only determine her own fate, but restore the voices of the men whose names had lain forgotten for generations. She straightened her shoulders, closed the folder carefully, and whispered into the quiet room. "All right, Charles Riggs, let's finish this together." The air seemed to stir in reply, a soft, approving sigh from somewhere deep within the house. It was only the wind, perhaps, yet it felt like history, breathing once more. The following days passed like a slow, deliberate heartbeat. Evelyn's house, once quiet and invisible to the neighborhood, now seemed to exist at the edge of something larger than itself. The coffins in the garage had become both burden and beacon, their presence heavy with the weight of history and choice. The gold bars, the government seals, the list of forgotten soldiers. It all seemed too vast for one old woman to carry, and yet she did, with the same steadiness she once used to guide children through books in her school library. Every morning she woke before Noah, brewed coffee, and sat by the kitchen table reading through letters that no one had read in 70 years. One morning, as gray light filled the house, she picked up the phone and dialed the number of the legal clinic for veterans she had written down days before. The man who answered spoke slowly, carefully, his voice the kind of calm that comes from decades of bureaucracy. When she explained who she was and what she had found, there was a pause on the other end, long enough that she thought the call had dropped. Then the man cleared his throat. "Ma'am, this sounds unusual. We'd like to send someone to talk to you. Can you come to the office, or would you prefer a home visit?" She hesitated. "Home, please. I'd rather not move what I've found." "Understood," he said. "I'll send a representative tomorrow. A Mr. Lawrence. He's one of our senior advisors." That night, Evelyn barely slept. She sat on the couch watching Noah draw spaceships on paper, the sound of his pencil soft and steady. Every few minutes she looked toward the window, where the faint reflection of the streetlight glowed like an unblinking eye. She wondered whether Charles Riggs had felt the same sleepless anxiety all those years ago when he decided to hide what he couldn't protect. By morning, rain had returned. The man who arrived just after 9 introduced himself as Adam Lawrence, a tall, gray-haired veteran with kind eyes and the careful gait of someone who had learned to carry both authority and empathy. His handshake was firm, but not overbearing. Evelyn led him into the kitchen, where the metal box and several folders were laid neatly on the table. He adjusted his glasses, scanning the documents with growing astonishment. "These are authentic," he murmured. Riggs & Sons was a real firm, closed down in 1984 after a fire. The owner, Charles Riggs, had been decorated for civilian service during the war. But this, he tapped the letter with the confession. "This is something no one's ever seen." Evelyn watched his face carefully. "What happens now?" "Well," he said slowly, "technically, this belongs to the U.S. Treasury. But there are provisions in the law for what's called found property of historical or federal value. You could be entitled to a percentage as a discoverer, especially if you cooperate fully and help identify any surviving families listed here. And if I don't?" He looked up at her, meeting her eyes. Then the government will take it anyway, only without your name on the record. She nodded, having expected as much. Then I'll cooperate. But on one condition. I want these names to be honored, not buried again. He smiled, a little surprised. I think we can make that happen. Over the next week, the house became a kind of command post. Adam brought a small team from the legal clinic, and together they cataloged every document, every gold bar, every bond certificate. They took photographs, measurements, and notes. The garage smelled of old paper and metal, and the sound of camera shutters echoed softly under the rafters. Evelyn stayed close, afraid to let any of it out of her sight. Reporters arrived within days. The first story ran in the local paper. Retired librarian finds Wubud treasure and storage auction. Within hours, it spread to national outlets, then to television. Vans with satellite dishes began to appear along Walnut Street. Strangers walked by slowly, peering through fences, whispering. Mrs. Bennett called from across the street to warn her. "They're talking about you on Channel 8, Evelyn. Be careful what you say." But there was no turning back. When Adam arranged an interview with the Department of the Treasury, Evelyn went in her best navy blue dress, the one she had worn to Emily's graduation years ago. She carried a folder of photographs and the original letter from Charles Riggs. The officials listened, polite but guarded, as she told the story from the beginning. The auction, the 3 coffins, the letter about the hidden funds, the lists of soldiers. One of them, a woman with a crisp white blouse and an expression honed by years of protocol, leaned forward. "Mrs. Grace, do you understand the significance of what you've done? I understand that those men died, and their families never received what they were owed," Evelyn said, "and that someone tried to protect that debt from being lost." The woman nodded slowly. "Then you've done more than most people ever would." When Evelyn returned home, the reporters were waiting outside. Microphones pointed at her like weapons, voices overlapping. "Mrs. Grace, is it true the gold was worth millions? Do you plan to keep any of it? What do you think Charles Riggs would say now?" She said nothing, just smiled gently, and walked past them into her house. Inside, Noah ran up to her with a piece of paper. It was a drawing of 3 coffins, each with a bright golden circle inside. "They're treasure boxes, right?" he asked. She knelt down, cupping his face. "They were," she said softly, "but they're also promises, and promises are worth more than gold." That night, she sat at her desk and wrote a letter to the Treasury Department, declining any attempt to claim ownership, but formally requesting that a portion of the recovered funds be used to establish a memorial for the soldiers named in Riggs's records. She added one final paragraph in her neat librarian's handwriting. "If there is any reward, let it come in the form of remembrance. I ask only to keep my home, so that my grandson may grow knowing honesty is not a disadvantage." 2 weeks later, a government courier delivered a sealed envelope. Inside was a formal letter signed by an undersecretary of finance. The words blurred as she read them aloud. The government had agreed to her terms. A memorial fund would be established. For her integrity and assistance in the recovery of historic federal assets, she would receive a compensatory award of $1.2 million after taxes and administrative costs. Evelyn set the letter down on the table. For a long moment, she simply stared at it, unable to move. When she finally spoke, it was barely a whisper. "We can stay, Noah. We can stay." The next months unfolded like a long exhale. She paid off the mortgage, repaired the roof, and planted a garden where the lawn had been bare for years. The neighbors watched in awe as contractors came and went, repainting, fixing, restoring. Yet Evelyn refused extravagance. Her life remained simple. Mornings in the garden, afternoons with Noah, evenings reading old books that smelled faintly of dust and comfort. But she did one thing that surprised everyone. She bought back the container she had found at the auction, paying the storage company a modest sum to deliver it to her yard. The same metal box that had once been the symbol of her desperation now stood behind her house like a monument. The 3 coffins remained inside, polished and empty. She refused to sell them or discard them. Instead, she added small brass plaques to each lid, engraved with words that reflected their journey: memory, duty, and redemption. In early spring, the memorial ceremony took place in the city park. Veterans, families, and reporters gathered beneath the clear sky. A bronze plaque stood on a granite base, bearing the names of 37 soldiers identified from Riggs's archives. A wreath of poppies surrounded it. Evelyn sat in the front row beside Adam Lawrence, her hands folded tightly in her lap. When the mayor spoke, his voice carried over the crowd. This monument stands not only for the fallen, but for those who keep their promises, even when time forgets. When her turn came to speak, Evelyn rose slowly, leaning lightly on her cane. Her voice was steady, though the words trembled in her throat. "I didn't find gold," she said. "I found responsibility. I found men who were promised something they never received. And I found that honesty, even when it seems small, can still move the world." When the ceremony ended, Noah placed a small American flag beside the monument. "Now they'll remember," he said proudly. Evelyn squeezed his hand. "Now they will." That evening, the house was quiet again. The news vans were gone, the reporters chasing their next story. Evelyn sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching Noah chase fireflies across the yard. The sky blushed with the last colors of sunset. For the first time in years, she felt no fear of tomorrow. Inside the garage, the 3 coffins gleamed faintly in the dim light. She had lined the walls with shelves of old books, turning the space into something between a library and a chapel. On the wall hung a photograph of Emily, her smile frozen in that forever young grace. Beneath it, a brass plate read, "In memory of those who gave, and those who kept giving." Before bed, Evelyn stepped inside the garage one last time. She ran her hand over the polished wood, tracing the engraved words with her fingers. "You can rest now, Mr. Riggs," she whispered. "You did what you could. The rest was never lost." Outside, the night wind stirred the leaves, and in the faint glimmer of moonlight, the coffins looked less like symbols of death and more like vessels of promise, the kind that carry hope quietly through time, waiting for someone willing to open them. When she returned to the porch, Noah had fallen asleep on the swing, the dog curled beside him. Evelyn covered him with a blanket and sat beside him, her gaze fixed on the horizon, where the stars had begun to appear. Tomorrow, she thought, they would plant 3 young oaks in the yard, one for memory, one for duty, one for redemption. When Noah grew up, those trees would still be there, tall and steady, their roots wrapped around the earth, like the story she had uncovered. For now, the world was still. The ticking of the kitchen clock drifted faintly through the open window. Evelyn closed her eyes, feeling peace settle over her like a soft shawl. Somewhere in that silence, she imagined the past exhaling, not as a ghost, but as gratitude. And when she whispered goodnight to the dark, it felt as though the years themselves had finally answered back. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. You can also watch more stories like this one right here on the channel, and if it moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it.